Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I'm Joshua Sharfstein, Vice Dean for Public Health Practice and Community Engagement, and a former health commissioner here in Baltimore. Our goal is to bring evidence and experience to illuminate critical public health issues. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Smith Rogers, producer of Public Health on Call. Today, Stephanie Desmond talks to Ben Zaitchik, a Johns Hopkins earth scientist who focuses on the significant and growing health burden of extreme heat. They discuss how climate change is disproportionately impacting people of color, notably those who live in cities, and what steps can be taken to cool our urban areas down. Let's listen. Ben Zaitchik, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So climate change disproportionately affects people of color. And today I want to talk about sort of why that is. And I guess my first question is, why is it hotter in the city than the suburbs?
So there are several reasons why cities end up being hotter than the surrounding area. One that we all hear a lot about is simply the lack of green space. When you have a whole bunch of concrete, your urban jungle of asphalt and buildings, and you don't have green spaces in terms of parks, open fields, street trees, you end up with less ability to take moisture in for rainfall to get into the soil and then to be evaporated slowly back into the atmosphere, which can help cool things down. Instead, what you end up with are these surfaces that are fairly dry, and there's not an ability to get moisture into the air. And so what ends up happening is the energy that comes into the ground ends up getting emitted back into the air as heat. And so that's a big factor. But it's not the only factor. There's also the building materials themselves, which are really good at absorbing heat. Some of them are dark. Even the ones that are not dark end up, because you have these tall buildings and these urban canyons, end up getting sunlight bounces around until eventually it gets absorbed and then gets held onto by some of these man-made materials and emitted slowly at night. So you end up heating up the night a lot, which is a big problem with the urban heat island. And there are other factors as well. There are all the engines and machines that are directly heating the environment. Air pollution can contribute to heat by re-emitting energy back into the urban area. And then there's just ventilation, right? If you've got a whole bunch of buildings around, it's harder for the wind to blow through. So there are a lot of factors that conspire to make cities hotter. But one thing we know is that it's pretty consistent across environments in this country that almost all the cities are hotter than the surrounding environment. You end up with this positive, what we call urban heat island effect, that affects most of our metropolitan areas.
And what does this mean for people who live there?
Well, it means it's hotter, right? And so during the summer, when we really worry about extreme heat affecting people's health, you'll have situations where it can be up to 10 degrees Fahrenheit warmer in the urban core and the surrounding area, sometimes even more, depending on the city and the weather conditions. And that can have an effect on you in terms of direct heat stress. Certainly, if you're outdoors and exposed to that heat. It can also lead to heat stress problems if you are indoors and don't have access to either air conditioning or the money you need to run those air conditioners. Certainly, people talk about the risk to life. Heat is known as the silent killer. It is on average the deadliest climate hazard in the United States year on year. And that's particularly going to affect vulnerable people like the elderly. But even if we look beyond the possibility of people dying during heat waves, you have all kinds of other impacts, like it can exacerbate asthma. It can cause folks with chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder to go to the emergency room. It can have a number of negative impacts on our mental health. It can have impacts on our ability to do the activities we want to do, right? Even if you're able to maintain your health, but you're not able to go and enjoy an outdoor activity, for example, or visit friends, or get where you need to go by using public transportation that might expose you to heat on the way. Those are all burdens that are being borne disproportionately by people in the city.
And many of the people in the city are poorer and they're more likely to be minorities. So I guess this is creating sort of an underlying health concern for a whole group of people who really don't need another thing to have to worry about.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, when we think about climate hazards to people's well-being in general, we often like to say that, climate is a stressor. And that's what it is. And so if you are in a community, or if you have personal characteristics that make you vulnerable or have lower capacity to adapt to such hazards, then those hazards are being imposed upon you as an additional burden to other stresses that society is imposing on you. With respect to heat in the city, for example, it's already been demonstrated that if you look at areas that were historically redlined, so those are those parts of United States cities where it was next to impossible for people to get mortgages, to get loans to improve properties, right? And this was all based on racist policies from the last century. Those places are hotter. And so you have a situation where historic racial injustice is leading to an additional burden. Climate is now affecting them disproportionately on top of other elements of urban development that have disempowered those communities.
Are there solutions that can be adopted quickly, or is this sort of an untenable situation?
The silver lining here is that this is absolutely something that we can address. And we tend to put these in two categories. There are things we can do very quickly, your acute responses, right? How do we deal with the next heat wave coming? And one thing about heat stress is that heat waves shouldn't kill anybody, right? It's not like the kind of climate disaster that comes in and it's like, how do you avoid the tornado? It's like, well, no, you can get through heat if people are ready. And so with good heat early warning systems, with the ability to set up cooling centers or to get people what they need to cool their environment, whether that be in terms of distributing equipment or knowledge or energy credits. And moreover, just checking in on people. I mean, honestly, the difference between someone making it through a heat wave okay and someone having a real health problem could be the difference of an open window and a bottle of water, right? You need to make sure that people are checking in on their friends, their neighbors, their relations who might be vulnerable to get through heat. So there's a lot we can do to kind of blunt the impact of a heat wave, but that is not going to be sufficient. What we need to do, particularly under climate change, is really be planning for urban heat mitigation. And the way we do that does take time, but it's still very much doable. It's about developing green spaces. It's about brightening surfaces, what we call, smart or cool surfaces like white roofs or less absorptive materials, fewer impervious surfaces, making sure that we've got a way for water to make its way into the urban surface so that they can evaporate back and cool off our environment. The fact is that the city is, as I said, can be 10 degrees or more warmer than the surroundings, but the surroundings are something we can try to aim for. So the more we can make the city a form that mimics natural environments, the less we will see these extreme urban heat islands.
So I imagine we're going to be seeing more of this as the climate continues to warm.
Absolutely. As the climate warms, we'll see more heat extremes, which we're already seeing over more and more of the year, right? We'll see potentially health damaging heat waves come earlier and later in the warm season. And the city will, in all likelihood, continue to be hotter than the surroundings. Now, the question of whether the urban heat island itself gets worse as we move forward, whether the city ends up being disproportionately warmer than the surrounding areas, it depends how we develop our cities, right? If we continue to sprawl and pave and remove greenery, then yeah, the urban heat island will get worse. If we can really adapt our cities, make them greener, make them more livable, then in fact, we might see a situation where the urban heat island could get smaller, even as we contend with these rising temperatures globally.
Is something like planting trees, does that help?
Trees are the solution to a lot of problems, right? Trees do a few things. First of all, they've got these roots that can help bring moisture out of the subsurface and then dissipate energy in the form of what we call evaporation, right? Evaporating water rather than directly heating the air. They also provide shade, which seems obvious, but that's a really big deal. And that's not actually directly reducing temperature. It still can be hot in the shade, but if you don't have the sun shining down on you, you feel a lot better. If you don't have the sun shining down the front of your row home, you're using less energy to cool that row home. And so trees can do a lot. Urban trees need help, though, also, right? Just digging a hole and planting a tree in this urban environment doesn't always work that well. We really need complementary approaches to the landscape so that we make sure that water is getting into those trees, that the roots have room to grow. And we have a situation in a lot of our cities where our urban street tree survival rate is low, the growth rate is low, because they're really confined to these tiny tree pits that don't allow them to thrive. A tree in that environment is not doing as much for you as a tree that perhaps has some more pervious surface around it so that water is getting into its roots are able to expand, and can really grow into a really pleasant and service providing tree that's providing relief from heat.
So do you foresee digging up some of the concrete and those kinds of things to put trees in some of these cities? Because that seems really like it might be a hard sell.
I think that's an interesting question. How hard is that sell? There's an expense associated, certainly. But there's also a huge expense that we sink in without thinking about it every year in terms of maintaining some of our concrete environments. And if you look at some of the historic landscaping that we see in cities, certainly in Europe and other parts of the United States and parts of Baltimore, the city that I live in, when we talk about looking in different environments and different neighborhoods, you can find kind of 19th century street environments that went in with bricks and more permeable pavers and things that have lasted over a century with no maintenance. And that's not even to mention all the good that might be doing in terms of protecting other downstream environments because it's not shedding water that's then going down and creating flood damage, right? So there is a capital cost associated with some of this that we need to think about quantifying the benefits and coming up with financial and conceptual models that allow us to invest in what makes sense over years to decades. And that's a challenge for so much of climate adaptation. But in this case, I think it's something that's doable and it's something that can be done at a range of scales. And cities are doing great work with this. I mean, you can look at certainly cities in Europe, but also New York City has done a tremendous amount on green infrastructure in recent years, recognizing the cost benefit of this if you just look a few years into the future.
And I guess my last question is sort of, what is your dream? If you could be in charge of all of this and make a difference in terms of urban heat islands, what would you say?
I think what so many of us are aiming for are cities in which every neighborhood is really able to live in the environment that they most want to inhabit. And so what I mean by that is if you look at most American cities, you will see that green space is underrepresented in poor communities. And there are a number of reasons for that. Part of it, of course, is just simple disinvestment. There's also the problem of maintenance, right? And so even when things go in, who's responsible for maintaining greenery, which does take some maintenance, but there's also just rules associated, right? Like, okay, what are the right of ways? When you walk around some of these communities with people who live there, there's a really strong desire to say, well, we want green spaces, we want parks, we want it to be cooler, right? We want to pull all of this together in a way that really makes this a more pleasant place to be out and about. And then once you make it more pleasant, there are more people on the streets. When there are more people on the streets are safer, right? There's all kinds of benefits that can come from this. And so I suppose what I would like to see is a concerted cross-city, cross-neighborhood effort to empower both community groups and their associated city partners to see these visions through. Because the vision exists. There are great plans on the books. And we simply need to make sure people have the tools and the resources they need to make it happen.
Ben Zaitchik, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Public Health on Call is produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith Rogers, and Stephanie Desmond. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Holly Cardinell, Spencer Greer, and Matthew Martin with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production support from Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Holes Fernandez and Amber Bryan Singletary. Thank you for listening.